This is a really fun segment for me to talk about because we've been involved in I'm not going to put my paper down, I'm just going to keep moving this. A number of data challenges throughout the years, 8 years. So they're seen here. A few of them are completed, such as FASIB and the Microsoft Hackathon that we did in the early days, focused on, for example, NIH, as well as rare disease oncology. We're in the midst of planning one with ADDI or Gates Ventures, and today we will focus on the last two. So really a little bit of a disparate therapeutic area, so antimicrobial resistance and type 1 diabetes, but you'll see some common themes here. So I'm just going to kick it off to talk about, some of you might be very familiar with the concept of data challenges, and some of you may not. So I'm going to spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes describing why we're involved in data challenges and why might you think about this for your team, for your group, or for your data sets. So there are really 2 types of data challenges that I see in terms of how to group these. What we call open or creative data challenges, allowing researchers to explore the data in any way. The ones that we're talking about today are these open type, but certainly they encourage novel discoveries and creative problem thinking. There are more focused or targeted data challenges. They have been run, for example, in Parkinson's disease and ALS, not by us, but by others, answering very specific questions. So at the end of the day, you know you're going to get an answer in a specific disease, for example. So the Sprint Data Challenge also, that was in the New England Journal of Medicine. So answering a specific question about the data set or in a disease is what we see for targeted data challenges. In terms of the impact of a data challenge is really, we see long-term effects. So creates long-term interest in the data set itself or data sets. Findings drive new research papers, potentially funding opportunities, and we'll see that today as well. And open access insights really encourage widespread participation. People who had not normally become engaged start becoming engaged. And that's what we call the spotlight effect. A data challenge really functions like a spotlight, attracting top experts to a specific problem, maybe not even ones in that specific therapeutic area. And the presence of a prize incentivizes participation and really cross-disciplinary collaboration. And we'll have a few excellent examples of that today. So scientists who might not otherwise have engaged with it are now able to compete and solve key issues in the area of interest. So next I'd like to hand it over to Deniz Dalton and her team. This is just before Deniz comes up here. I want to say why we picked this one to highlight. The T1 DEXI data set is by far our most requested data set on Vivly, with over 100 requests in a very short period of time. So those of you who are sharing data on Vivly, you know what a number of requests looks like. We're getting over 100 requests, really spurred by this data challenge. So I hand it to Helmsley Charitable Trust for having the foresight to do this. Thank you, Deniz, and your team.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you. It is not every day that we are very happy with the attention that our type 1 diabetes and exercise data received, over 100, close to 200 requests, and over 15 publications since September 2022. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition affecting 1.5 million in the US and close to 10 million globally. It's a 24/7 condition, and we are asking people with diabetes manage their diabetes perfectly with very imperfect tools, such as continuous glucose monitors, insulin pumps, and very complicated algorithms that run these devices. Exercise makes it even more complicated. You might be doing a soccer practice versus soccer game. The context is very different, and it has a very different impact on your glucose. Or you're doing a high-intensity interval training versus aerobic training or resistance training, it has a very different impact on your glucose when you have type 1 diabetes. That was our original vision. We wanted to address this gap. It was not prioritized by industry. So we wanted to open up the real-world data for real-world solutions, and that's where we find Vivly. Vivly is a platform that allowed our data set to have new people looked at it in new ways, leading to new discoveries. The mission of our program is changing the trajectory of type 1 diabetes. Helmsley Charitable Trust has 6 programs, one of which is type 1 diabetes. The reason why we have type 1 diabetes, one of our trustees has 2 daughters living with type 1. And changing the trajectory of type 1 diabetes is not possible without variety of researchers and industry thinking and working on the issues that we care. The process, the decade-long process that we've been running the T1DEXI, Type 1 Diabetes and Exercise Initiative, proved to us that intentional data sharing drives impact beyond a single study team or study. Today, I am joined by Robin Gell and Dana Lewis. This panel is here today because we are pushing the field forward for type 1 diabetes and exercise. Robin and Dana play a very crucial role in pushing the field forward. Robin Gell is a director of research operations at Jaeb Health Research Center, which is a nonprofit CRO. She has over 25 years of clinical coordination experience, and she has done a Herculean job running this very complex, we talked about simple or complex studies, very complex study, multiple devices, different time intervals, 4 weeks, 750 people. So she's done a Herculean job also driving the multidisciplinary team of advisors. That is also, people relations is also another component that she's expert in. Dana Lewis and Robin brings 2 hats to this conversation, to the panel today. She's both the data contributor hat as well as the data challenge awardee hats. Dana Lewis is an independent researcher, very untraditional researcher. She's an innovator, founder of OpenAPS, which is a do-it-yourself automated insulin delivery system. She also lives with type 1 diabetes, and she brings in the data challenge awardee perspective to this conversation. She has been involved with international cross-disciplinary consortiums and has been an investigator many, many years. Today, we're going to help you answer one key question. Is the data challenge the right pathway for you to reach your goal? Because the truth is, not every data needs to have a challenge. In our decade-long journey, in 2016, Helmsley gathered a think tank. We wanted to find solutions for people with type 1 diabetes exercise worry-free. We gathered KOLs, key opinion leaders, people with diabetes, Jaeb in the room, and we walked into the rooms thinking that we were going to fund solutions. That's what we do. We walked out of the room understanding that we did not have the right data. The data, 10 years ago, was too controlled, treadmill, 10 minutes in the clinic, or too small, 50 people, or too short, maybe 3-4 days, or limited in scope, one type of exercise, running and the treadmill. T1DEXI data was 750 people, 4-week study, real world, it's not controlled. There were some controlled elements. It was wide in scope in terms of exercise, aerobic, high intensity interval, and resistance exercises that were specifically modulated with videos, as well as just simple, real-world physical activity, gardening, swimming, yoga, walking to the bus, running for the bus, which has different effects for glucose. it was complex. And Robin, I want to take a pause here, and I want to ask you your reflections, because that 4 years before we made the data available, you were crucial in running many pilot studies to make sure that the data integrity and the data quality was there, and that the data was intentional and it was fair, meaning findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Do you want to reflect on your process a little bit before we made the data set available?
I can do that. So the FAIR principles for us really guided our process from the start. So part of our mission at the Jaeb Center is expanding scientific knowledge. So we commonly share data sets. That's usual practice for us. But what was really unique about T1 DEXI is it wasn't an interventional study, and it wasn't even really a study designed to answer a single research question. It was the central goal of this, the whole main objective was to create a data set that would be really rich, have a lot of information so that other researchers could look at these data and help us to solve a real challenge, which is managing glucose around exercise in people living with type 1 diabetes, both in adults and children. So that meant data sharing wasn't just something we would do when the study ended, which was our usual practice. It was something that we had to think about from the start, what data we were going to collect, how we were going to collect it, how to make sure it was going to be meaningful and usable beyond our own team. And we had a huge investigator group that represented different areas: clinical, exercise, nutrition experts, engineers, diabetes experts, even psychologists. And there was no shortage of ideas of what data to collect. But the challenge was to combine those ideas into a data set that we could use that could support that diverse analysis, but was really realistic in terms of the burden and of the data collection and the cost of data collection. The preparation phase was really critical for us. We transitioned from really in-clinic early pilot studies, and we recognized those weren't going to work because they were going to be too controlled and give us data very similar to what was already out there. We understood from those pilot studies what data streams were most valuable, but we also learned what was going to be too burdensome for either sites or for participants to really contribute that data effectively. So we learned that that in-clinic approach wasn't going to work, and we designed a direct-to-patient study long before COVID made that a common practice. So we were doing this before COVID ever hit. We planned that direct-to-patient study, and that really allowed patients to contribute data from wherever they were. And it gave us real-life data, and it also expanded our reach and our inclusion of who could be part of this study. They did not have to live near a clinical site to be part of this study. And we also had to think about data standardization really on how are we going to format these data, align those definitions, coding structures, device data formats, so that the data set could be interoperable and accessible and combined with other data. And a key part of that was that there were no standards in pediatrics in devices or prevention in exercise. So we had to actually work with CDIS to develop the standards for those studies. And that was an experience in and of itself. We worked with experts from those data areas and really learned kind of what were all the different types of data that could be in the scope of these areas, so we knew what to put into the formatting of those modules. So our effort to make that data set fair was really not something we layered on at the end. It was baked in right from the start, and it shaped the way we planned and collected and curated the data.
Thank you. And I remember this moment, I think it was 2020. I looked through Zoom, I looked at Robin, and I said, oh my goodness, you have planned this study completely remotely, and we're in the midst of COVID. How lucky are we? Thank you. As I mentioned before, we were very intentional both in the data collection and building the timeline for the researchers to be able to respond to our data challenge. One thing that we were able to do with Vivli's capacity, we actually asked researchers to register with Vivli first And then Vivly would confirm to us that they have signed the data use agreements and looked at the data, download the data. By the way, 99% of the people download the data. They did not use the environments, but that's a few years ago. Maybe things are changing now, as I'm learning today. And so we had to build capacity at Vivly too, because we had more than what we anticipated demand, which is a good problem to have for your data set if you're running a data challenge and if you're trying to get to solutions. And original goal, yes, people looking at your data is wonderful and great, but original goal of Helmsley was to get to solutions. So we asked researchers to look at the data, find the problem from the real world data that they want to solve for, create a solution, and then test the solution again with people with diabetes, because we wanted clinical evidence that their solution could help people with type 1 diabetes. And that required significant incentive. They were allowed to ask $3 million over 3 years if the project required that, and because the projects had all clinical components. And I want to turn to Dana, who went through this process herself. And I remember, again, a conversation we had during her concept was moving towards the proposals, because we received 35 concepts and we asked 14 proposals to be submitted to evaluate them for 7 awards. Dana and Robin are some of those 7 awards. But Dana, we loved your solution concept, and then we realized that the clinical component was missing. And you made a partnership with the Harvard of the West Coast, Stanford. So can you tell us a little bit about how you brought together the multidisciplinary team and your lens of the process?
Yeah, so for context, I'm an independent researcher, which means I don't work for an institution. I'm not a clinical researcher. I'm kind of an oddball out there. So in order to do these research projects, I do partner with the Harvards of the West. In this case, I actually partnered with the University of College Dublin and a technical team who I had nerd sniped, if you're familiar with this phrase, into being interested in diabetes research. And we had put together a proposal. We had looked at the data and we said, something we're seeing in the open source real world data community, we think we see in this clinical trial data, which is really meaningful to see that replicated through commercial devices. So we submitted a concept. And what I loved about this process is we were able to get feedback from you. And not just, you're not a fit, you're an oddball, or you don't fit in our process, but you said, can you find a clinical partner? Because we do want this clinical trial process not to be a later step, but integrated into your process. So because I happen to have relationships in the diabetes community, have done other diabetes research, I was able to reach out to the team at Stanford and say, this is our idea, this is how we want to do it, this is what the clinical trial would look like, and develop that partnership. And in fact, because of that, we actually were able to bridge 2 projects, another one at Stanford that was developing into all-in-one project that then moved forward to the proposal stage. So it was really nice for me to be able to actually look at the data and again, replicate the ideas and the concepts and basically prove, not when we get to the funding stage, is this idea even feasible, but look at the data and validate it first, again, on this really rich, complex data set, but also have those time and those feedback points of not just wait until your grant either did or did not get funded, but to have that feedback along the way was really, really valuable, and to have the encouragement and support to say, yes, you're an independent researcher, yes, you have this kind of technical team, but this idea is valid and we do want to develop it. So that process worked really, really well for bringing in new perspective, people from outside of the traditional system, which is where a lot of the innovation is coming from nowadays, of people who are able to see real world data and bring it into clinical trials and vice versa. It's not always coming from institutions. That's not always where innovation and insight is.
Thank you. Great insights. Remember our original, not showing my slide. There we go. Remember our original goal? We wanted to get to solutions. So we gave 7 awards off of the data challenge. Each of those projects addressed one of those gaps. And one key gap we saw in the data, I mentioned automated insulin delivery systems. Automated insulin delivery systems has a continuous glucose monitor, eyes of the system, a pump which is the arms of the system, insulin delivery, and a brain, the algorithm, and the heart, the person, because you can't take the person out of the loop. Dana knows that very well. And the novel algorithms, we invested in novel algorithms because the current systems cannot handle over 30 minutes of exercise with type 1 diabetes. We saw that in the data. And Dana's project is a net insulin on board concept, which could potentially be, once it's developed and optimized, can be implemented to commercial systems because it'll be a code that can be taken and applied if the industry is playing with us. And current insulins are also not good enough. I know we have great insulins, but they're not fast on or fast off. So when you add exercise to the type 1 diabetes management, current insulins are not able to manage that complexity. Robin's team is testing a novel insulin, which is an inhaled insulin, in conjunction with automated insulin delivery, and seeing if that could be a potential solution for people to manage their exercise and different types of exercise, looking into novel ways of managing this condition. Currently, people with type 1 diabetes needs to manage their exercise or could manage their exercise with carb intake. What does that mean? Eating a muffin before you jump onto the treadmill. That's a little counterintuitive. So when we saw this proposal, a proof of concept, trying whey protein in lieu of carbs and mitigating the impact, both aerobic and resistance exercise, which have two different effects, we're seeing actually very promising results. We're going to be showing some preliminary data at ATTD in 2026 in Barcelona. Our grantee is going to publish that. And so it's exciting. It's a novel way of managing type 1 diabetes and exercise, potentially. We also saw there are clinical guidelines. Everybody talked about the guidelines in the previous panel, and we love the guidelines. However, the guidelines are a little complex for exercise and type 1 diabetes. We saw that in the data. Very few people actually were able to implement the guidelines into the day-to-day. So Robin and her team are working on simplifying the guidelines with video modules for adults with type 1 diabetes so that they can simplify and they can see how they can apply it to day-to-day. Women has different factors affecting their type 1 diabetes and exercise management, like menstrual cycles. And this is a very understudied area. So when we saw the proposal come in, understanding how menstrual cycles can be managed with exercise and type 1 diabetes, and actually improve the clinical guidelines, because there aren't much, and improve the commercial solutions potentially, this is one of the projects that we are pursuing. Now, none of these solutions will get to people without industry. Helmsley is an early believer, instigator, idea, promoter, but we cannot be the entity who can push these solutions to people. Industry is. So we all play our role in the ecosystem, actually related but not from the award data challenge. We did one more project after this, kind of strengthening this innovation. One of our grantees is applying for a potential FDA tool for medical device development, MDDT tool, so that these novel algorithms can be evaluated more quickly. It's a simulator framework, and you don't have to run a whole clinical trial potentially. If the FDA approves that MDDT tool, you could run your scenarios, and it would be a trusted tool. It would make FDA's job easier, hopefully. I want to turn into my panelists now and get more in-depth information about this whole data challenge process and T1DEXI initiative, and see how do you think your role and motivation contributed. We'll start with Robin, and then we'll go to Dana.
So my role really shifted during different phases of the project. I wore a lot of different hats, from designing the study, which is my typical daily job, clinical trial design, to leading the study, to really supporting others who were using the data. And that was really where a key difference was for me. I think about data as a renewable resource. And like a library that grows in value with every reader that checks out a book, every new user of that data makes that data set more powerful. So every researcher that touches that data adds another chapter to the story. And that reuse can lead to new discoveries and long after the original study ends. And the impact isn't just for researchers, it's for participants too. So similar to things that other panelists have mentioned, one of my main motivations is really honoring the people who volunteered. For me, when I look at the T1DEXY data set, every data point represents a person living with type 1 diabetes who chose to share their time and their effort to contribute their data and advance science. And sharing the data really fulfills that promise we made to those individuals. It's a way of respecting them and their contribution because it continues to have impact long after that single study. And once the data sets were finalized, really my role changed to something I think of now as a data librarian. I started to feel like one because just like in a library, I was directing people to find what they need, answering their questions about the data, and just pointing them toward the right resources and supporting their work. So it's all about really continuing to keep that cycle of discovery going so that we can continue to grow in knowledge.
Thank you. Dana?
Yeah, I think my motivation for looking at this data set at first was having access to commercial device data. As a person with diabetes, you're actually really locked out of your data. That's a choice made by industry. And so I had access to open source data from the real world community. But in order to test whether the insights we were developing among the community were replicable among using commercial devices, we really wanted to test with commercial data. So it was a really exciting opportunity for us to be able to apply and access the data and see all these different commercial devices and be able to test. And so far, yes, everything that we are seeing as a phenomenon in the open source automated insulin delivery systems, we are seeing in the commercial systems, which means these issues and gaps and opportunities are not a weakness or an artifact of the particular algorithms run in the open source community, but it's an artifact of type 1 diabetes and the challenges of insulin delivery, like Deniz mentioned, particularly when we start looking at exercise. So we're starting to see not only does hypoglycemia, for example, maybe put a wrench in your exercise, it can take up to 48 hours for your physiology to normalize after you have a low glucose episode, which can sound like maybe not a big deal, but if you do this over and over and over again your whole entire life, a lot of that adds up. And there's a lot of the stuff that's out of your control. So it's really empowering to be able to look at these data sets and say, oh, we see these opportunities to start to intervene, to start to apply solutions to, for example, this 48-hour time period and say, what if we could course correct or cut down the variance over 48 hours? So maybe it's only 12 hours, right? There's still area for improvement, but it would be great if what happens today doesn't affect me 2 days later. So again, it's really exciting, and I think my motivation really comes around how can we then communicate these results back to industry in a way that encourages them to actually implement it in their devices, and also to show them the power of contributing their data to these data sets, and also to patients who can use the data today, but in these data sets, it really empowers a lot of subsequent research that was not possible years ago when we don't have insight to this data. So industry plays a really big role, not only in choosing to make data available or have data go into these data sets, but which data and the data granularity. Specifically for diabetes, we have a lot of room for improvement in terms of the data granularity of insulin dosing, for example, for not only patients, but then again, in these clinical trials, being able to use retrospective analyses to understand what was happening and why, and what is the interaction and interplay between humans. Humans with diabetes do a lot of these interactions, and so does the system, but there's not a lot of insight into the human-computer interaction. And this is even before we start talking about AI. So you can imagine that the complexity is going to grow, and therefore this need to really understand what a system is doing and why, and how can the human interplay with that. That's a big opportunity, and one of the things that I'm excited to see improve in subsequent data sets.
Thank you. Helmsley, as a funder, learned a lot throughout this process, and I shared some of our learnings and the incentives we built and the timelines. Can you both share, Robin, we'll start with you, some of the successes and the lessons learned from your, you were involved both as a data contributor and a data challenge awardee.
So one of the biggest successes for us was just how widely the data was used. We knew that there was going to be interest in the data, but we were surprised by how many different people wanted to use these data. It wasn't just endocrinologists or exercise physiologists. I think the data challenge really accelerated that interest. It gave people a reason to dive in and look at data sooner and come up with really kind of solution-based questions. So I think that was really interesting for us. For personal experience, obviously, 2 of our currently ongoing projects really came out of us looking at these data after we collected it. So these weren't pre-planned research questions for us. They were things that we looked at after we assessed the data set as a whole. And one of those, as Deniz mentioned, focuses on afternoon exercise and glucose management, which is especially challenging. And so we're looking at that novel inhaled insulin that has that faster PK/PD profile. And that may be a solution there. And another one was we looked back, and there's consensus guidelines out there around exercise, but they're incredibly complicated, even for clinicians to understand. And most patients don't even know that they exist. So we took those consensus guidelines and broke them down into educational intervention modules to really kind of deliver that information in a more easy format for patients. I think another major success for us was really creating opportunities to connect people. Clinical research often operates in silos, and it's competition instead of collaboration. And data sharing can flip that model. So when patients or when investigators came to us with questions, we were able to see what areas they were interested in and connect them with others that were doing complementary researchers, and then they could work together. And that really just accelerates the pathway of research when we establish that collaboration. Lessons learned, one of the big key takeaways is the data support and usability. We thought a lot about what data would be of interest, but we didn't think quite as much as about how people would want to use the data afterwards. And we formatted the data with CDISC standards, as I mentioned earlier, but not every investigator is fluent in that CDISC standard language, so that can be a learning curve alone for users, so we had to provide a lot of support in that area. And so we need to make sure that people have the tools to use it efficiently. When you're planning for data sharing, you need to make sure you have clear documentation, even sample code for analysis for people, and intuitive data dictionaries to really help them understand that data really quickly. So making data available is one thing, but making it usable is another. And I think for us, you have to weight that equally in planning. You have to understand what people might want to do with it at the end. And I think, as Dana mentioned, there's a challenge when it comes to people being able just to share their own individual data. It's an incredibly complicated process, just getting that access. And we need to do a better job reducing those barriers so that people can contribute the data from their devices, applications, when they want to.
Yeah, and building on that, I have the opportunity to host a data set for my community outside of Vivli. So I have experience managing a large data set, working with researchers, and one of the critiques that I've heard about my data set is it's a very complex, rich, real-world data set. So I was excited to see this really great, clear data dictionary, but was also surprised that even my team, with our familiarity with these data sets, we still had questions. And so we actually reached out quite a bit to Robin's team to ask questions about where data was, or was this data element collected? Because despite all the thoroughness and the great planning, there were still elements that were inadvertently left out that we could have used for certain analyses. So that was one of the challenges. It's been, okay, how do we mitigate the fact that a certain piece of data was not collected in this data set? The other, I think, challenge and opportunity is some of the data use agreements even prevented sharing the same data set across teams because of our multidisciplinary, multi-country setup. So for example, our team in Dublin couldn't necessarily hand, here's our cleaned version of the data frame over to the folks at the Harvard of the West part of our team. And so they had to re-clean and redo the data set. Now that gave us an opportunity of really making our code thoroughly reproducible. We actually ended up sharing, and do share, all of our code open source. And it's now actually being used by teams outside of our team across the US who are accessing the pediatric and the adult data set. So it actually provided an opportunity. So I would say as you're thinking about a data challenge too, think about incentivizing and supporting the teams that are going to make their code open source, shareable. Make sure to promote that as well. Because that also, for reproducibility, when you want to, in a couple of years, do a study and reproduce insights, being able to start from that same clean data set is really, really important. And so having the tools and having them be openly available and for people to reuse, to make sure we're all working off of it's the same data set, but the way you clean it, the way you filter it, your inclusion, exclusion criteria, depending on how you code that, it could be a completely different data set. So making sure we're all working from the same thing is also really important.
Great points. And I will say, some of the deficiencies of the data points that we didn't collect, that's an opportunity for Helmsley, for the funder, to subsequent data sets to have that, right? So what we also demanded from the awardees of the data challenge, we said, okay, you're gonna have a clinical study, but you will put back that data to Vivly platform so that people, if you're collecting additional information that is complementary to this exercise data, then it's building up, right? So it's just continuing the cycle of sharing and making sure that the resources are there to be able to do that. That's really important. Thank you. We are experiencing challenging times in research, and that's our last question. I just want to ask this panel, how do you see the data challenges and data sharing in playing an important role in the future of research while we're experiencing challenges in every way?
So I think today it's more important than ever that we get the best use out of the data that we have. These studies take tremendous effort in terms of cost, site burden, participant burden, and so we want to really maximize that value. I think today's data can answer tomorrow's questions. Every data set is like a time capsule. And treatments changes over time. In type 1 diabetes, we have an emergence of SGLT2 use, which is very widespread now, and the way insulin delivery has changed over time also makes it challenging. So we can never go back and get these kind of data again, but they can still be very useful for us looking forward to drive solutions. As others have mentioned, we're also seeing a lot of interest in using AI to access these data, not to replace researchers, but to help them to spot trends and emerging information that they may not have otherwise seen when looking at the data. And so it really only works well if the data is really high quality and usable and accessible. So I think it's really important that we share data now more than ever. We also have growing opportunities to collect data directly from individuals. And so that makes everything really exciting and more immediate. And we need to push that path forward.
And there's a demand for this data, both for the independent data set I use and for people who are interested in this data set. I talk to probably dozens of people a month about the use of this data. There is an interest in solving those problems. There's a real clinical need and a real world need for people living with diabetes. And I would say with AI, it makes it easier for people coming from all backgrounds to actually analyze this data, answer questions, create solutions. And so I think it's exciting because we have these time capsules of data sets. We are able to do a lot of this a lot more efficiently. I think some of the way, I can say this as an outsider, that research has been done is the way it's always been done. And so there's cost in terms of time and the physical burden of the way trials are run that costs too much compared to what it could be given all the efficiencies that Robin mentioned. So I think there's really exciting opportunities to really rethink how do we do these trials, how do we collect or reuse this data in the future, knowing that some of these data going all the way back is actually really useful still today.
Thank you. Some key points to wrap up for everyone's benefit. Being intentional in data sharing drives impact beyond a single study and team. And some action items, if you are actually thinking about a data challenge, are think about the long-term effect, long-term management of that data set, because it could serve 10 years later for a purpose. And encourage small, untraditional investigators so that you can get to new innovations and new discoveries. Be a connector. I think Robin did a wonderful job about connecting the teams, because collaboration drives impact. And stay curious, because I'm excited to learn about the next data challenge. I know they had a different format, they had a different goal. I think you have to decide whether or not for your goals, data challenge is the right pathway. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. We're open up for questions.
So the nerdy researcher in me was beyond excited about this. In 2018, I'm with CDISC. We are a nonprofit, and I met up with Gina and Deniz at Partnering for Cures, so another collaborative event that brings together research teams. And we talked about the need for a data standard in this area. And so it is so exciting to see from 2018 to where you are today. And I just want to say that data standard, not only the data set, and we've been working with Vivly for many years on standards and data dictionaries and how we can continue to digitize and improve and make things better, but that data standard that Helmsley invested in is available for all researchers globally. So I'm just saying that of the effect of not just that one data set, but the data standard is also available for use for all type 1 diabetes as well. So thank you, but also yay. Sorry.
Well, we're very thankful for all the key opinion leaders and the clinical experts and people with diabetes contributing to that effort. But we also know that having data standards is not enough. You still need to build capacity both in the contributor side, in the researcher side, but also understand that there will be some of those codes that can make it easier and developing those. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Kevin Poirier from Novartis. I just had a question about the derived data sets, and so you're saving them and making them available, and I guess you have the code with it that you use, but how do you store them on Vivly? Are they like a standalone, or are they in the folder with the original like raw data from Helmsley? How does that work? And I guess a question to Vivly in general, a lot of investigators have their own derived data. Do you does any of that ever get saved, or do those investigators like donate that derived data to you to keep in the folder with the original data? How does that work?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Kevin, and thank you so much, Mike. You know, that's a great question. I think we've long thought about that because of how much investment has gone into the derived data. The governance is a little bit tricky. And so that's something that we're working out. So just stay tuned is what I would say. Thanks.
And Robin, did you have a comment in terms of how we posted the data?
So we actually have a raw data set from some of our devices that sits separate from Vivly. It's really meant for machines to talk to machines. So it's a really very, very large data set, and at the time it could not be housed in Vivly. And it can't be de-identified because of the format that it's in. So it has to be used under a separate data use agreement. But all of the derived data is actually in Vivly. So the derived data is there. And it lives there, and I think part of the research challenge is for the investigators that were fortunate to receive these awards from Helmsley is to contribute their data and their findings back, so it will grow that original data set even further.
And your comment about code, I would love to see, not just for us, but for future projects, that code that's validated of, oh, this is workable, this tells you what's in the data set, this is how to use it, et cetera, kind of like building upon what's available in the platform now. It'd be great if the code was hosted with the repository, so you download the data, you download a Jupyter notebook, and here's the runnable code that just works to get people up and running more quickly. I think that's a great opportunity for a lot of data sets.
Thank you so much for listening to our panel. I think we have a break now.
Thank you so much for a terrific panel, all three of you, and Dana, Deniz, and Robin. So we're going to, I'm not going to say the word break because then everyone will leave. We're going to actually have you go up to the beautiful boards, take a red marker, Julie, is this right? And vote for one or two concepts that you will either affirm or like to prioritize. Red dot. Okay, place a red dot in one or two areas. So I'm going to ask you to do that. We will come back here at 11:05. So red dot. So you have one or two votes, so use those sparingly. Thank you.
I hope it was engaging. No, it looked so familiar to me. It's wonderful to meet you in person finally. I saw the back of the panel.
Everything together was such a big picture, and then they can really start to understand what's happening to their glucose